Hi, I'm in the back of the airplane. We're going to kind of go through the interior cabin tour. And the first of which I'd like to talk about my Copilot for a moment. This is my dog Jack. I use him for all of my aeronautical decision making. He barks once for yes and twice for no. He lost his right glass eye in a poker game, so he has to wear this patch. We got him from Jake Cutter from Tales of the Gold Monkey. He now lives here in Spokane. Say hi, Jack. Woof woof. So that's him. Back in this aft storage area, I can carry up to 400 pounds. I carry a spare tail wheel, a spare fuel pump, set of mag points, a condenser, set of spark plugs, a bunch of tools, duct tape, safety wire, etc., and a jack. Old airplanes tend to eat tail wheels, so we always make sure we can change tail wheel in the field. Also back here, I've got 4 20-pound sandbags that I carry depending on CG. When the airplane is light, we've got to carry nearly 100 pounds back here, so that's kind of important. And I can close this watertight door, which is required for flight, obviously. The door that gives you access to the cabin on my left has a yellow ladder that we typically store back here for water ops. The idea being, in an emergency, we don't want the ladder placed in a point where it would compromise the ability for people to egress the airplane in an emergency. I've also got a rolling cart, food cart here for my granddaughter, so she goes up and down the aisle with gummy bears and juice boxes for in-flight service. Okay, as soon as we get in the airplane, we turn this aft switch on, which is an auxiliary bus. And that aux bus is independent of the big 24-volt system that runs the airplane for starting and systems, etc. This runs the internal LED lights. It potentially runs a mooring light back on the top of the tail. And it also can run the bilge pumps as an option. So when we're sitting on the water all day floating around, the bilge pumps will work. The emergency exit, obviously, you pull this handle in and the door swings open and latches. The main cabin door, you have to pull the top section down first and then close the main cabin door. As we described earlier, we do take that ladder assembly and it goes in that aft bulkhead. For water ops, that door is watertight and has to be closed for safety. We've got 7 seats back here in a brown line system. They can all be removed and either faced for club seating or trail seating, or remove them if we need more cargo. Each passenger has his own headset with mic and phone capability. In addition, every seat, underneath the seat, we have a life jacket. And we require all of our passengers to wear life jackets for all of our water ops. It's also important that the life jackets are manual inflate, not water automatic inflated. In an emergency, if you had to get out of the airplane in an emergency, it's critical that you get clear of the airplane before you inflate that life jacket. We've also got a little fold down for water bottles and a little personal zipper pouch for each individual passenger. And of course, an ample number of barf bags for those unexpected violent biological events that we've had to experience a couple of times already. We also do carry a maritime radio for talking to harbors and boat people if we ever have to talk to those guys. That's very helpful. In addition, if you look along the floor of the airplane, I've also got these doors that open, and I can visually look for water at station 26, station 13, and all the way forward. So whenever we've been in the water for any length of time, we pop those doors and make sure we don't have a significant amount of water in the airplane, which means the bilge pumps didn't do their job, or we breached the hull beyond the bilge pump capability. So it kind of gives you an overview. It's pretty roomy, and we do find for water ops, the airplane likes to be aft CG. If we're lightly loaded, I'll put adults in these 2 very back seats. It does help us for land ops to move the people forward. It likes to be kind of nose heavy on the land and tail heavy in the water to prevent porpoising, etc. We've got our first aid kit, a fire extinguisher, and a seatbelt cutter. In many horrific seaplane accidents, the seatbelt gets pulled so hard that the mechanical release won't work. So I keep seatbelt cutters in the airplane as well, which is important. Sitting in this position, all of the passengers have visibility of our gear status. And of course, one of the most horrific things that can happen in an amphibian is to land in the water with the gear down, which is kind of unforgivable. In many instances, it can lead to a fatality. So I've got green for grass and blue for water. And I always assign a co-pilot the responsibility of validating the gear status, and one of my passengers, their job is to validate the gear status for every land and every water op. And we're pretty psycho about that, you'll hear as we fly the airplane. Typically, the gear down accidents happen to more experienced pilots, so we're always on our guard. You know, when you get really comfortable with the airplane and get complacent, I think that's where the problems are. We've also got the gear warning system that comes from Lake Air, that when the airplane gets below 80 knots, it actually interrogates the gear status and tells you aircraft is configured for water landing, repeats that message until I hit the reset button. We find with time that can almost become noise. It's amazing what your mind can tune out. I just want to underscore the seriousness of validating the gear status every single time you put this thing in the water. The manual says if you put it on the land gear up, you'll slide on the hull. You remove the wheels, lower the gear, jack it up, put the tires back on, and take it back to the hangar. And the third time you do that, you have to replace the keel strip, which we don't intend to do either. But that's obviously a landing gear up isn't, it's obviously embarrassing, but not fatal. It doesn't even damage the engine. So we don't intend to do that either. I want to just emphasize quickly, we talked about opening and closing these windows rather. And you can see I've got a pin. So it's critical this pin get pulled and the window slides back. Obviously for a water takeoff, it's critical that window is closed, or believe me, you get a pretty good bath on takeoff. That window slides open, you're going home with wet Levi's, that's for sure. Okay, upper left, I've got my electrical panel, and I'm going to turn the master switch on. I've got two engine field switches, left and right. Both alternators are 70 amps, and they run in parallel. So I've got 140 amps of current, which is kind of critical. The feathering system on this airplane pulls 250 amps, and the gear retraction system pulls 150. So we're sucking a lot of power out of this thing for the mechanical correction, the electric gear retraction, and the feather pumps really pull some power. I've got two landing lights, which are pretty obvious, and I've got a wig-wag function. If I hit the wig-wag for water work, the landing lights alternate, and they're LED, the equivalent of 250 watt bulbs, so they're pretty powerful. I got strobes, nav lights, and then I can select my mooring light to either aircraft ship power, or I can flip this up and use my aux power that we talked about earlier. Also, same is true of my interior lights. I can shut the dome lights off. I can run either aux power or ship power on my aux lights. And these lights are kind of cool. I can select them for either white light or red light for night. I've got LED panel lights that really flood this whole thing beautifully. So that's all my electrical service. When the master is on, I've got a light here that tells me the master is alive and well. As I look down the left side of the panel here, I've actually got my basic flight instruments. I've got low oil warning lights for both engines and low fuel pressure warning lights for both engines. And everything I have on the pilot side is redundant on the co-pilot side. So you can fly this airplane completely independent from either seat, including all the vacuum gyros have two independent vacuum systems. So IMC, we could fly this airplane either seat. Everything I have on the pilot side is redundant on the co-pilot side. Over here, I've got a couple other warning systems. I've got a tailwheel lock. If the tailwheel lock is unlocked, it is red. When the tailwheel lock is in the up position or the pin is installed, the light goes off. So for landing on land and takeoff for land, we always make sure that tailwheel is locked. I've also got a bilge pump warning system. And if I'm running on ship power, the blue light comes on. If I'm running on aux power, the blue light comes on. That lets me know that my bilge pump has power either from the aux bus or from the ship bus. This is my warning system for the landing gear I told you about. The transducer senses the airplane below 90 knots, samples the micro switches, knows that the gear is up or down, asks you to confirm the gear status, and you hit that button. I've also got 3 lights. I've got an independent micro switch for tail wheel on both mains, green for down, blue for up. I've got a red light here in my 4-pack, which is the manifold, pressure, RPM, and my engine gauges, which is red. And this says gear unsafe for water. So that red light means the airplane is a killer right now. With the landing gear down, this airplane is dangerous. It's a seaplane first, and that kind of has to be our mindset. When we retract the gear today on takeoff, you'll hear me say, airplane is configured as a water airplane, is now a seaplane. I'll ask the co-pilot to verify it, and one of my passengers. The gear doesn't go down again until we come back to a land airport. And everybody in the cabin and the crew verify that gear status. So that's what that red light does. Here I've got oil temp, fuel pressure, and oil pressure. Kind of a nice little pack here. Moving myself back. I've got cylinder head temp, and I've got carb heat induction. Little notice on the carb heat, we pull back for carb heat hot and back for carb heat cold. If we've got carb heat on this engine, we're limited to 30 inches of manifold pressure. If the carb heat gets left on and we go to full power, the carb heat is so effective on this engine that you can detonate and create damage. That carb heat's kind of a critical thing. We talked about the flaps earlier, which are vacuum. Flaps are up in this position. I've got a little pin here with my right hand, gives me flaps 30. That's what sucks the one piston off that cylinder. Flaps 60, both pistons get sucked to both extremes of that cylinder for flap 60 and flaps up. Prop controls, we pull back to reduce RPM, we push forward to increase RPM. Got a friction lock up here that controls the friction lock for the throttles. I've got a friction lock here that controls the friction lock for the prop controls. Above the throttles, I've got mixture controls. All the way forward is rich, all the way back is lean. I've got to pinch both of these in order to release them to get them to work. And the throttles are really smooth and wonderful. We do find in moving the throttles in flight, you kind of walk them with your hand. You can do that very smoothly. If you pull back, it tends to be jerky. If you walk it, you can make just beautiful, smooth power transitions and keep the Pratt & Whitney engines happy. The mag switch is a little bit unique. You've got right mag, left, right, both, off, left, right, both, off. Then you got a master here. When this switch is killed, it kills both engines absolutely to the ground. And we'll find that when we're doing docking work or things get really tight, we're down at a hard idle at 400 RPM, just kind of ticking over. We can actually blip this guy and actually kill the engines on and off if we're trying to really taxi slow as we get up to a dock. So that's kind of a neat feature. These are my starter switches, left and right. Hobbs meters, and outside air temp, and a voltmeter, cabin speaker. As I work my way around behind my shoulder, it's got a really wonderful fuel gauge system, which is just a big boiler tube. And you'll notice on ground, we read the back scale. In flight, we read the front scale. When I was doing the pre-flight earlier, we dipped the tanks with a stick. It showed 70 gallons. And you can see my boiler tube verifies 70 gallons. This is a glass tube. My worry is if in flight, if somebody flung a camera around and broke that tube, I've got a little valve here. I can actually shut that ball valve off. God forbid if that boiler tube gets busted in flight, we could fill a whole airplane full of gasoline. So I've got this little safety valve. I can actually kill that system. As I work my way around, I've got a shutoff for each engine. This is the fuel system shutoff to the left engine and the right engine. Of course, if we had an in-flight fuel fire, the first thing we do is shut that engine down, and I would kill the fuel source to that engine. As I work my way around, this is the crossfeed we discussed earlier. So when crossfeed is off, the right and left engine are running solely on their respective mechanical engine-driven fuel pumps. If I lose an engine-driven fuel pump in flight, that engine would start to quit. I'd see a low pressure fuel warning, and I could open that crossfeed, and the single remaining fuel pump on the good running engine is capable of supporting both engines. They're 400 gallon per hour pumps. So that crossfeed says that the good remaining mechanical driven pump is capable of running both engines. You'll see during the course of the start, we're actually going to verify and make sure that works. I've got a fire system here. I can select this ball valve to right or left engine. I can pop in a circuit breaker and throw a switch. That mechanical switch then blows a squib, and there's a Halon bottle ahead of the Copilot feet that completely fog the nacelle with Halon for fire protection. So in the unlikely event of a fire, we kill all the electrical to the appropriate engine, we'd cool the fuel system to that engine, and I'd hit the fire bottle and feather and shut that engine down. Continuing across, I've got the main fuel selector. Right now it's in the off position. Now both engines are running on the right tank, both engines are running on both engines are running on the left, and then back to off. It's critical when you land this thing on the water, the very first thing you do is shut that fuel off. The reason being, this airplane sits on the water on one of the pontoon wing floats, and it'll crossfeed like crazy. If you forget to shut this off, 20 minutes later you got a bunch of gas in one wing, you got a heavy wing, which could make takeoff problematic. In a more dangerous situation, you could transfer all your fuel to the right wing, to the left wing, and you got a very low fuel condition. You could take off and turn away from that low tank, or turn into that low tank, and unport the tank and have a double engine failure. My point being, if you would cross-feed all of your tank right to left, that potentially that right tank might get very, very low. And if you were in a right-hand turn shortly after takeoff, you could unport that tank and you'd be in big trouble. So that's want to be very conscious of that. It also makes the takeoff very difficult with a heavy wing. The header tanks or sump tanks left and right are here, and this little valve here is what we throw to sump the tanks. So I sump with this valve respectively left and right, and I've got another little valve here that I can sump the gascolator. I've also got the ability to manually pump fuel pressure with what's called a wobble pump. With the fuel on, I can wobble up fuel pressure. And then finally over here between my legs is the primer. And I can push this primer down and turn it to the left and manually prime the left engine, push it down and turn it to the right and manually prime the right engine, and then switch it back to the middle and it locks. So that's my primer, left engine, right engine. You'll see during the start procedure, we go through the little rain dance to get that going. As we all know, when you start a radial engine, you don't start it, you have to coax it lovingly to life, right? In the stock Goose, the landing gear was retracted and extended manually with this crank handle. It was 52 turns to get the gear up and 52 turns to get the gear back down, which is kind of a workout. We've modified this airplane with an STC from Valentine, also McKinnon, that puts a B-17 flap motor with a clutch such that we can electrically retract the gear about 80%. So typically on a normal takeoff, I'm in the cockpit, and when I want to retract the landing gear, I put my hand on this pawl, and I got to flip the pawl up. Once the pawl is up, I'm then going to bring my hand up and turn this switch on. And that switch turns the retraction motor on, and this yellow light illuminates while that motor is running. So again, on takeoff, the pawl is up, the switch is on, the gear retracts to about 80%. At the 80% point, the light goes off, tells me the motor is no longer running. I kill the switch, and then I manually grab the pump hand, the crank handle, and I ratchet up to snub the gear into the well. It's important I don't over snub. I can actually retract that gear so tightly that I get the pawl and the retraction gearbox really locked up, and it can be very difficult to extend the gear. So basically, once you electrically retract, we just do about 5 little ratchet pulls on this lever to snub the gear. When we come back to the airport, it's time to land. On the land, I put the pawl down, I slide a lever on the crank towards the Copilot, and then I have to crank the handle this direction 52 times. Now the gear goes down fairly easily because gravity is helping you, isn't it? The retraction task is quite a bit more difficult because you're having to raise the gear. So when you manually raise the gear with the crank, it's a real muscle job. Putting the gear down, as we just suggested, pawl down, slide towards the Copilot, 52 turns. The gear comes down very nicely. At the full extension point, the last part of the gear goes over center and it locks. There is no gear down lock per se, other than the fact that the geometry goes over center. With that said, I can verify gear status 3 ways. I've got gear lights, blue for water, green for grass. Secondly, I can feel the crank terminate at its full excursion in the gearbox. Next, I can look in these viewing windows, and I can actually, every landing, I can actually look down there and I can see that gear leg over center. So I don't trust the lights. I don't trust my feel. I verify lights are off. The crank is full at its fully extended point. I look down and make sure I'm over center. So typically the pilot looks at the co-pilot wheel, and the co-pilot looks at the pilot wheel. So both guys look down and verify gear is down and locked. Thirdly, at each float, I've got a small mirror. I can actually look in the mirror, and I can also see that the tail wheel came down correctly. My light verifies it, and I can mechanically look at that little bubble mirror and see that the gear came down as well. When the gear comes up to its full extension point, again, pawl up, switch on, snub, snub, snub with switch off. When the gear is fully retracted, I get a knuckle here. At the top of the gear leg, I've got a happy face. So I look in there and I look for a happy face in both those things, which verifies the wheels are up. In addition, even with the windows closed, I've got bubble windows. I can visually look out there and see a wheel extended, or I can see a wheel retracted into the side of the fuselage. This is the elevator trim for the airplane, typically 0. For land ops, we go +1 white. For water apps, we go -1 black. And I've got a rudder trim over here on the left sidewall here that typically is set at 0 for the most part. Okay, on the right side of the airplane, obviously headset hanger, I've got bilge pump system, and I can select bilge pump either ship power or aux power, and each bilge pump is either auto, off, or manual. So if I'm in manual mode, I can actually run that pump. I've got a forward bilge pump, a mid, and an aft one back here. So I typically leave those on auto. All of our circuit breakers, when we do shut the airplane down, it's important we pull the landing gear breaker, the starter breaker, and the feather pump breaker as well, and the fire system. The point is we have a lot of kids in and out of the airplane. I always make sure these breakers are pulled. Again, landing gear, starter, and feather pumps, and the fire system. In case the kids get in here throwing switches, I don't want them retracting the landing gear when the airplane's in the hangar. One last thing we didn't talk about was the feather system, and this is critical. In an emergency, the one thing I love about this particular Hamilton standard system is we can push the feather button in and the engine will feather regardless of whether it's running or not. Right now, with the engine sitting static, if I had the master switch on and the feather circuit breaker pushed in, if I pushed that button, that blade would feather in 7 seconds. Some of the other feathering systems require a windmilling engine or they will not feather. As an example, with the Hartzell Pratt & Whitney system, if you're below 900 RPM, you can't feather. So if you blow a master rod and you have a catastrophic engine failure, you're pretty much sunk. This engine, even in the unlikely event of a catastrophic engine failure, I can feather that propeller, which is a huge, in my opinion, life-saving feature. In addition, these ham standards pull quite a bit harder than the Hartzels do. The downside is they make more noise, which in my opinion is kind of cool. So they pull like crazy. We did some static pull tests, and these props pull almost 180 to 200 static foot-pounds harder than a Hartzell does. Hartzels particularly were put on Gooses and Beavers for noise. But again, we don't fly this thing commercially, so that's not an issue. So it's all of our rest of our circuit breakers, the feather bumps, and again, if I turn the master on real quick, I've got lights that identify all of my door statuses if the doors are open or latched. That's kind of critical. In the nose of the airplane, and to my left is the vacuum status for the accumulator for the flap system, and typically this runs about 15 inches of mercury. To my left is the Halon fire bottle, and here is a valve, or gauge rather, that typically tells them I am in the green. So I'm at 600 psi for Halon, and below that is this 28 volt squib, which would detonate or fire that bottle when that switch was turned on in an emergency. If you remember, ball valve selects engine, we hit the fire bottle, and this 600 psi Halon bottle fogs the appropriate nacelle. One other little detail here, these are the rudder pedals, which are adjustable. I can hit this little kick switch and move the pedal back or forward. For parking the airplane, I can bring these little hooks over and actually hook over the rudder pedal, which also locks the rudder for wind protection, kind of a gust lock, if you will. So these literally go up and over. If I pull the pedal forward, this goes over the pedal. And once I lock the other side, this is actually the parking brake system. It just hooks that go over the pedals. There's only brakes in this airplane on the pilot side, and they're very effective. We've got wonderful Cleveland brakes and STC for Grove 1-inch master cylinders, which work fantastic. You can see there's very little travel. And this thing's got brakes like your grandmother's Cadillac, which is wonderful. One of the key points of having a Grumman Goose is a panda head, so your grandchildren can stand in the nose when you taxi out to entertain the tower. Okay, up here in the nose, we've got an anchor system here on the left. This is also a watertight door that must be closed for water ops. And this is the vacuum accumulator that we talked about. This great big trash can thing holds 15 inches of mercury, and the valve open and close is what puts the flaps down. I've also got a port here for a headset. So when I'm mooring the airplane, someone can wear a headset and I can communicate with them. I've also got a 28-volt port here I can plug in for a water cannon so we can shoot other people. We've got a storage area here for mooring ropes and accessories that we need for water work. When this hatch comes closed, I simply turn and retract these pins to open and close. I'll demonstrate closing the hatch here real quick. We come all the way closed, I turn the handle, and that locks it. And that's watertight. Next up, we're going to do a engine pre-start and engine start.